Take flight in your mind and in your heart to Bethlehem. Let's go by little Jesus' manger where he lay. And after this song, meet me at Luke, the 2nd chapter and the 7th verse. Away in a manger, no crib for him. The little Lord Jesus lay down his sweet head. The stars in the sky look down where he lay. The little Lord Jesus asleep on the hay. The cattle, the Lord Jesus, no crying does he make. I love you, Lord. I love you, Lord Jesus. Look down from the sky. Lord, stay close to your children as we go through troubled time. Let me say that again. I love you, oh Lord Jesus. Look down from the sky. Father, stay close by your children through these troubled times. And the word says, and she gave birth to her son, her firstborn, and she wrapped him in swaddling clothes and laid him in a manger because there was no private room for them in the inn. Now let us study to show ourselves approved in the word with our pastor, Reverend Dr. Timothy Lake.
Thank you again, Sister Kathleen, for that wonderful devotion. It's fitting for our Advent season to begin right there on that note that you led us. We are here again at the Union Baptist Church in Fort Wayne, Indiana, for another Bible study session. And we're still in the book of Luke. That's good news. The better news is that we're at the end of Luke. And so we're in the 24th chapter. We're going to roam around that chapter a bit as we conclude our study of the gospel according to Luke. It is the work of the Holy Spirit to make it so that we are concluding this gospel at the passion narrative of Christ as opposed to the Advent season that we're in at the birth narrative. But such is the providence of God, right? So we are where we are. So Luke's gospel is nearing its conclusion, but we should know that Luke is a 2-volume work. So we have Luke Acts, and so originally it was 1 volume, but we have separated them into 2 books in 2 volumes. So even though we come to the conclusion of Luke's gospel as we have it here, we know that it's really a work that picks up again in Acts, right? And so we are going to just light right in here on the 24th chapter. This is after the crucifixion. Jesus has been buried, and he has been buried in the tomb. So this is the point of the resurrection. And so we find the opening chapters of the 24th verse, an account of the tomb. So let's read from 24, chapter 24, the first 12 verses. But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they came to the tomb, taking the spices that they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they went in, they did not find the body. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly 2 men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. The women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you, while he was still in Galilee, that the Son of Man would be handed over to sinners and be crucified, and on the third day rise again." Then they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all this to the 11 and to all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them who told this to the apostles. But these words seemed to them as an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb. Stooping and looking in, he saw the linen cloths by themselves. Then he went home, amazed at what had happened. And so that's the way we get the opening of the account. Now, so we do what we do. We slow the text down. We heard some various things that are familiar to us from the other Gospels about the experience of the empty tomb, the discovery of the tomb empty. Here we have Luke's version, and Luke is following Mark's version really very closely. So if you have your Bibles and you want to turn to Mark 16, beginning at the first verse through the 6th verse. I'm not going to go over this point by point because we did that in our study of Mark. We read the two accounts side by side, and so we pointed out the differences between the accounts of the empty tomb or the tomb account in Mark. We know that Mark is the older of the two Gospels, let me say that, and Mark is the shortest of the three Gospels, right? The three synoptic Gospels. And so Mark is the older and the shortest of the three. So we have strong evidence from the text that Luke is following Mark very closely in terms of his account here, but there are some significant editorial additions in the Luke account. So if we read Mark 16, when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us? From the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb." When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side. And they said they were alarmed, but he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. you are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been risen, he has been risen, he is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Two different accounts of the same story, but with various additions and subtractions, I guess. So Mark is the older of the Gospels, and Luke is the one that is following after. So we can see that not only is the tone different in Luke, but some of the actual content is different, right? So it's a little bit rearranged, and there are some editorial additions in Luke's gospel. So this is to account for the fact that Luke is, in part because Luke comes later. So when you come later, you have the ability to have maybe access to traditions that have emerged or surfaced after the writing of Mark, and so that's part of the response for the differences. And then also Luke's on agenda, like Luke has told us from the beginning, he has an agenda, right? So even if you go back to the opening of Luke, he tells you why he's writing the gospel. Is that so he can set the record straight, right? And give Theophilus a true account of what happened. So Luke has an agenda. And also Luke's on emphasis on of the way in which Luke placed the blame for the responsibility for Jesus' death, and where he places the emphasis there, and the fact that Luke is more interested in the spiritual, priestly nature of Jesus' mission. And so Luke would also be more interested in the spiritual, in the culmination of the priestly tradition in Jesus' resurrection. So it's priesthood all the way through for Luke. There are some striking things to be said about these differences, but you've heard the two, and I'm not going to go over those in detail again. What I want to do is to think about what we heard. So in the Luke account, the Lucian account. First, it was the first day of the week. That parallels the Mark account. So it's the day following. So it's the first day of the week. For us, that would be Sunday, right? In the Jewish tradition, it would have been Saturday. And so we have the first day of the week, and it's early in the morning, right? So it's early that they came to the tomb. They were taking spices that they had prepared. So this signals some organization, some forethought, right? They had already had an agreement, we can assume, that they would go and do this, that they would make preparation for the burial body. We know that in Mark's and Matthew's gospel in particular, we have an account of Joseph of Arimathea asking for the body, right? And Joseph Joseph I can't remember who was with him, actually took the body down together, and they actually did a kind of quick dressing of the body. So Jesus' body wasn't just thrown in the tomb, right? Taken down, thrown in the tomb in haste, even though there was some rush to do it because of the coming of the Sabbath, right? Or you can't be touching the body. You have to be clean, go through the ritual of purification. And so we have the account of Jesus being taken from the tomb, the cross, and then quickly dressed for the burial, right? But here we have an account where it's the women implies that Jesus, whatever was done to Jesus' body, right, it wasn't a full account of the burial ritual. And so the women were coming to do the body justice, right? And so that will require some preparation to do. And so we see that there's some coordination there, and they have purchased the spices of themselves that were necessary to dress the body, so they already have the resources. Some resources have been expended to do this, right? So these are not women without means. These are women with some resources to be able to to have the spices ready to go. The issue of here in Luke's account, the stone is already rolled away when they get there, as opposed to in what we read in Mark's account, where we read of a conversation that the women had on their way to the tomb about how they were going to move the stone. Right? And so in Luke's account, the stone is already gone, right, when they get there. And so there's no conversation about moving the stone or who would move the stone. And they did not find the body, right? So they did not find the body there. So these are some of the elements that are there. So, and so we can think about the way in which these things operate. So they went to prepare the body. They did not find the body. The stone was already rolled away. But what they found was two men, right, in dazzling white clothes stood beside them. And so we read earlier in verse 3, they did not find the body, and while they were perplexed about this, so they didn't find the body and they were perplexed that this is strange, they're trying to figure it out, right, what happened, and then suddenly the two men in dazzling white clothes did. Now this is an allusion to some kind of angelic figures that are there, and then they have a conversation, right? So the women see the angelic figures, the two figures, and then they bow their faces to the ground. And of course that's a position of worship or a genuflection, right? A recognition of the superiority of the encounter, right? The person you're encountering, the beings that you're encountering. So you may think of it as a motion towards worship. And then the women were terrified. So think about that. They're terrified and they bow to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen." And so without saying a word, the women are given full explanation of what has happened. So they were perplexed, and then the explanation comes that Jesus has risen. Right? And then they said, "Go. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified, and on the third day rise again. Then they remembered his words and returned from the tomb. And returning from the tomb, they told all this to the 11 and to all the rest. In Mark's gospel, they were so terrified. And what we get is in Mark's gospel, what we get is when they come to the tomb, what we get in Jesus' death and the empty tomb, the overarching emotion is fear, right? And so in Mark's tomb, it ends with fear, right? So it ends on a note where the people are, the disciples, the followers of Jesus, are huddled together, closed behind doors, right? So fear is, and it ends there. Here, we don't have that notion of fear as gripping them into paralysis, right? They're fearful, they're perplexed. That's different than fearful. They're perplexed. They have a bit of terror because you're seeing the celestial beings, right? So you would be scared and you don't know what's happening. As the explanation comes, they become less fearful. The terror lessens, right? And they actually go and do what was said, what was told of them. In Mark's gospel, they don't even do it, right? So they're told to go and tell, but they don't because they were so fearful, right? They don't say anything. They, the women, right? But here, they actually, are not gripped to paralysis and so terrified with fear that they actually go and tell the others. They told the 11 and to all the rest. Now, that little note right there. So not only did they tell the apostles, right, but they told everybody. So here is an image of not just the 12, the 11, right, including these women, but you ought to think of a group of people, a crowd of people who are affected by this this event that has happened, the Passion of Christ, right? So it's not just the disciples that we know. It's not even just the named women who we see, the 3 women who are named here, but it is that little line that happens to have to be in the other women with them, right? So it wasn't just 3 women in Luke's gospel who went to the tomb. In Matthew's gospel, I think it's just 2 women, and so we have 3 women who are named, but there are other women too, right? So it was a group of women. Notice that they're all women. Some people make a lot about that they were all women, and so some people claim that that's an evidence in and of itself of the truth of this event. That this event must have happened because they put the witness, the eyewitness, and the testimony in the mouth of women, the least respected people in society, right? Why would you put such important information in the mouth of women? That's the group of people who would be most likely to be dismissed. And we see some of that in the text, right? And so the people who would not be credible, the people who would not be in any position to teach and tell anybody anything, especially men, right? But because the gospel writers tell us that it was women who were the first witnesses and the first ones to proclaim the resurrection, it must have some veracity to it, some truth to it, because if you were telling the story and you're trying to convince somebody of something, you wouldn't put women in the position of carrying that news. You would maybe make Peter do it, or somebody of stature, right, of power and position and authority. You may put them in, but you definitely wouldn't put a woman in that position. So some people use that as proof positive, at least part of evidence for this is a claim that probably happened, more so than not, because they wouldn't tell it this way. And then so they say, but these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. And then you have the backing up of the tale of the story of the testimony by Peter, who got up and ran to the tomb. And in other gospel, it's John runs with Peter and actually runs ahead of Peter, right? And Matthew, John runs ahead of Peter and actually gets to the tomb first, but he doesn't go in. It's Peter who goes in. He lets Peter go in first, okay? So you have a different slight account here, but Peter gets up and goes to the tomb. So the consistency here is that Peter enters the tomb, right? And he stoops down to get into the tomb. Now think about that. Peter is stooping to enter into the tomb. So when I went to Israel, and I think I mentioned this before, they have those two locations of the crucifixion and the burial. So the skull, the garden skull, garden tomb, they call it, which is a contender for the site of the burial of Jesus. And then you have the Holy Sepulchre and as the place where Jesus was entombed, right? So they have two competing sites for the burial of Jesus. And so in the garden tomb, in both of them, the garden tomb is obviously an old Jewish burial ground area where the tombs have been carved out of the hill stones, right? And so it's a stony ledge area where people have carved out these tombs in there. And so once you see those burial sites in the traditional way that they would have been buried at the time, you can see why he stooped down. It's because the tombs, the opening to the tombs were short, right? So they were not big holes like we have our traditional doorways, but really short, openings. Matter of fact, I'm about 5'9", 5'8" and a half. I take all of my inches, right? So even I have to stoop to get down, to get in it, right? So that tells you that the openings are not large themselves. As a matter of fact, from the archaeological research that exists, the archaeological coverings and findings that they have of different tombs, the stones that would have been placed in front of the tomb would have been there so that, animals wouldn't ravish the corpses, right? So the way of keeping out wild animals and to discourage looters, right, from coming in, looting tombs. And so the stone wouldn't have been so large either, because if the opening is small, you don't need a large stone around it. So probably the stone would have been about my height, right? And so not just giant stone that we see in the images that we see in these images, but maybe more of a stone that was more manageable. And so in the Matthew's gospel, as a matter of fact, we get the sense that in Matthew's gospel, Joseph puts the stone in front of the tomb. So it's something that one person could do, right? So it didn't take a whole lot of people to do it. So those women could have rolled that stone. Let me stop that. But for the seal, of course, the seal that was there. I'm just talking about the physical structure of it, right? That's why they needed a seal. I said I was going to stop, but let me stop. About the stone being there. And so we have here in the account of the three women, we have here the substitution in Luke's gospel for Joanne, for Solomon, right? So there's a flipping here. Mary, the mother of James, probably the same traveler, same name of the mother of James, who we see in chapter 8, verse 2 in Luke's chapter. So we see this James, this mother of James again. So it's probably that one, but we don't know for sure, but probably. And then the other women. These women, we know, followed Jesus from the beginning of his ministry. So these are not people who are just coming on the scene late, but they were part of early Jesus followers, right? And had followed him around from Galilee area all the way down to Jerusalem. So these are people who were active, in a sense, loyal adherents to Jesus. And we know Mary Magdalene is the one that Jesus cured of the possession, right? So she was loyal to him after that. And so these women probably had resources, because to be able to follow Jesus around meant that you had to be self-sufficient, because remember, Jesus doesn't have anything, and if you're following him around, you still have to have a place to sleep, you have to have things to eat, you still have to have your clothes laundried, all of this kind of stuff has to happen. Resources are needed. So the people who followed Jesus and followed Jesus closely from place to place were people who could handle the expense of being away from their labors, right? But yet still have resources to take care of their needs, right? Because nobody's farming, nobody's fishing, nobody's has an income, and that way Jesus doesn't have a group that is working for him in that way. But these people who are following Jesus have some support, some resources that support them in their ability to follow Jesus. So a lot of us think that we would be one that would follow Jesus if we was here, if we were there at the time. Well, not if you was, a laborer on somebody's farm. That if you follow Jesus, how are you going to eat? Let me stop. You get the idea. So people who are following Jesus, and these people with these means, and largely a lot of those women had resources, probably were business women and had a source of income from whatever properties that they had that were being sent along the way, and that they could send back for. And those resources helped to fill in the gap for those people who had less means. So this is like a big group of people, like you see marchers in the 1960s, in the 1960 marches. A lot of people didn't come with anything, but they did never lack anything either, because people supply resources to the marchers, like we do with the protesters now today. So this is what is happening, that's going on. Some of these women in particular were people who not just followed Jesus, but actually supplied the resources for Jesus' entourage. They actually put up their own money to help feed people and provide whatever needs that the ministry needed. And then they cooked and did other kind of things. Let me stop. All right. And then so they say that these words were seen as idle tale, as an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb, stooping down and looking in, and by themselves. What I want to do is to read the walk to Emmaus. Read that in concert with the resurrection of Jesus. So the passage that we just read about the empty tomb, and then the passage that precedes that one about the two gentlemen walking to Emmaus and encountering Jesus. I want to read those two together to see if there are parallel readings that we can get out of those two readings. So let's read through parts of this Emmaus story. So think about the empty tomb story that we just read, and then as we keep that in your mind, rolling in your mind as you read through the Emmaus story, and see if we can find parallels in the stories themselves. So on the same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you are walking along?" They stood still, looking sad. One of them, whose name was Cleophas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deeds and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him. Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish are you, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets had declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead of them as if he were going on, but they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the dinner table with them, he took bread, blessed it, and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" The same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. And so I want to suggest there are parallels in these two stories that we often, in our regular reading or our reading of them in isolation, we miss. And so, starting with verse 4 in chapter 24, while they were perplexed about this, suddenly 2 men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. And so if you think about verse 17, in the Emmaus story, and he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you are walking along?" They stood still, looking sad. So this is 2 accounts of conversations that are happening as the women see that the tomb is, that the stone is rolled away, and they didn't find the body, so they are perplexed. And This is a conversation of two who have witnessed the death of Jesus and now are talking in perplexity among themselves about these events. So what we have here is a narration of two accounts of people trying to figure something out, right? They're trying to figure out what has happened, trying to make sense of what they have experienced. So that starts the conversation. So I want to say that there's a parallel narrative structure there of this kind of trying to suss out some meaning from the events that are in front of them, right? And then verse 5. So verse 5, we have, the women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground, but the men said to them, why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but he is risen. So if you look at verse 16, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. So they are looking for some body, and the women are looking for the body, and they cannot find it. These men are looking at Jesus, and they cannot see him. Right? So we have a parallel vision account where something is obscuring the vision, right? One, the body is gone. Two, Jesus is cloaked with some kind of cloaking, has cloaked their vision from him, right? So he cannot be recognized in that way. So there is something that is invisible, right? Something that is not in sight, clear-sightedness here. Here I'm talking about the narrative tropes in the narrative, right? And so in verse 6, we see, remember how he told you when he was still in Galilee. And then in verse 25, then he said to them, oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary for the Messiah, that the Messiah should suffer from these things and to enter into his glory? Again, it is a sense of calling back to memory, a sense of breaking open or new interpretation of that which is already known, right? Something that they were already aware of, but didn't see it, didn't interpret it, had missed the interpretation of it in light of who Jesus was. So Jesus is saying, in light of who I am, didn't you recognize that these things are to happen? That's what he's saying to the men. And for the women, the angels, the angelic figures are saying to them, didn't you remember? And don't you see now how you ought to have understood what he told you, right? So this is a breaking open of knowledge with new interpretation, right? New meaning to the interpretation of old knowledge. Also in verse 11, but these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe. And so we go to verse 22. Moreover, the women of our group astounded us, right? They were at the tomb, so they were at the tomb, they were at the moon, and they did not find the body there. They came back and told about the deeds of the English and that he was still alive. So here is this also, the initial impulse is to still not believe, right? Is to be still not fully convinced. And so you see that in the same narrative structure. And then verse 12, but Peter got up and ran to the tomb, stooping and looking in, and he saw the linen cloths by themselves, and then he went home amazed at what has happened. And then that's with verse 31. Their eyes were open and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. So again, now it's a coming to recognition, right? A coming to acceptance here. I would say more, but I want to move on to some of the things. These are some of a quick sketching out of a kind of parallel reading of these two stories, these two accounts. And what I want to say is that narratively, the writer, right, is writing the same kind of story. These stories are the same. They're just different content and a different scene, right? But the story themselves, the narrative structure, the formal elements inside the structure are the same, right? Still hitting the same points. And so in verse, let me stop that. You notice here that Luke is placing the blame for Jesus' death and places the blame for Jesus' death. It validates the earlier fears of the religious leaders regarding the people. So verse 20 to 21. So verses 20 to 21. And how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes. And besides all this, it is now the third day since these things took place. So what we have here is Luke is saying what? Our chief priests and leaders did this, right? See, they completely blame the religious leaders for this. And it verifies Luke's continual repetition that what had held back the hands of the religious leaders was what? Fear of the crowds, right? And so what we have here is confirmation here. We had hoped, meaning all of those people, remember, it's just not the 12, it's not just the 11, it's just not the 3, but it's a whole lot of people and the others, right? So they had good hope, they had good reason to fear the people, because the people had a lot of hope in what Jesus meant and would do for them and for their cause, right? So this wasn't just idle chat. So Luke is confirming that the religious leaders had right to fear, because there was a lot of hope in Jesus. And so here I want to talk about some quick points about the post-resurrection meal as a proof of Jesus' identity. So we see Jesus having, in verse 30, we see Jesus breaking the bread, right, and the wine. So this is, of course, a nod towards communion, right? And so Jesus is, but we don't actually get Jesus eating it, but we see Jesus, you can make an assumption, but the text doesn't say that, right? So Jesus breaks and blesses it, and then he vanishes. But it is a meal, it is around a meal. And that meal gives, evidence, reveals who Jesus is. It's the same way in verse 40 and 41, right, where we get, and when he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. While in their joy they were disbelieving, Oh, that'll preach right there, right? So, and still wondering, he said to them, "Have you anything here to eat?" Again, another kind of meal, right? As evidence of who Jesus is. So food is playing this role, this pivotal role in the story, just as the meal time where Jesus inaugurated the communion event, right? So meal is a very important thing because it's the opportunity to show forth Jesus, right? It's for Jesus to show up around these kinds of the table experience, right? Verse 49, let me try to do this kind of quickly. And see, I am sending upon you what my Father promised. So stay here in the city until you have been clothed with power from on high. So Jesus gives the command, right, to stay, right? So now Jesus is first, now this is his first command. Stay, telling them to stay there because he's going to give them the power from on high, right? What the Father has promised them. And then what does he do? In verse 50, he says, then he led them, so now Jesus commands them to stay. Then Jesus leads them out to Bethany, right? And then the verse 51, Jesus does what? He blesses them, right? So Jesus leads them, directs them, is the one to follow, right? And then Jesus blesses them, and then he ascends, right? He's off to sea, right? He withdrew from them, and he was carried into heaven. And then the last part, verse 52, after the sequence, is then they worshiped him, right? So, and then they worshiped him. So this is to be marked out as a different kind of occasion than what we saw earlier on in the chapter, where the women were at the tomb. Verse 5, the women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground. And here in 52, and they worshiped him. So this is a different thing. They're not worshiping those angels, right? The bowing is more for respect and a kind of, you're in the presence of divine beings, right? But it's not worshiping, right? And so here they actually worship Jesus. And then they go to the temple and they stay there blessing God, right? And they stay there blessing God. And so this is different than being terrified. They start off in verse 4 terrified. They end in verse 50. In verse 52, worshiping. Right? In Mark's gospel, they start off terrified and they end terrified, right? And so here is a different account. All right. So there in a few little time. So I want to point out something that may be a contentious point in this gospel narrative, is that here we read in 1 Corinthians, right? 1 Corinthians 15. Just go there real quick. 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 8. Is the first creedal formula. It's our first creedal formula of of Jesus, of the resurrected Christ, the resurrection of Christ. So first, 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8, what you have here is the crypto-creedal formula of the early church. This is what they believed, right? This is the profession of faith. For I handed on to you as of first importance what I in turn had received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, in that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scripture, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Then he appeared to James, and then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me also. That's the creedal statement that what the early church believed about Jesus. Right? This statement predates the Gospels by about 25 years. So Paul is writing this letter about 25 years after the death of Christ. So this is one of, so Paul's writings are older than the gospel writings themselves. So Paul's letters predate the Gospels. And so this letter, this creedal formula, gives us a sense that of what the early Christians were saying about Christ before the Gospels were actually written down. And so what you don't have here in Paul, and this is the point that I really want to make, is that what we have in Paul's writings that are older than the Gospels, right, in terms of written form, you don't have any recognition or any mentioning of the tomb experience. Right? Paul doesn't say anything about the tomb. None of that story about the tomb being emptied or women coming there. None of that. You notice what he says here? That he first appeared to Cephas. That's not the story we just read in the gospel, is it? Right? And especially not the story we read in Mark and in Matthew, right? So there are other traditions that Paul perhaps is unaware of, right? There are these other traditions that Paul is perhaps unaware of, or these other traditions emerge after Paul, right? Meaning that it's like you may not think about asking, how was Jesus born in the immediate surrounding circumstances of his death? I mean, nobody may have asked that question. You know, how was he born? Maybe that's a question that comes up after that you have time to think about, where somebody asks, well, how was he born? How was he born? Was it Mary and Joseph, his parents? And they say, oh, no, let me tell you the story, what happened. These are questions that have come up after. Some of these traditions that emerge, that continue to emerge, seem to be traditions that come out of questions that are asked of Jesus in the succeeding years that people probably didn't ask while Jesus was alive, right? So we know each other, but it's when we see your obituary that we understand details that we didn't know about you, right? Sometimes we know more about you from when you died than we knew when you were alive, right? Because we ask different questions. Right? How many kids did he really have? Yeah. All right. So it's curious that Paul doesn't mention any of these traditions about the tomb at all, and it could be that Paul just didn't know them. We also can see these, Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians verse 15, 35 through 55, and I'll let you read this. So 1 Corinthians 15, 35 through 55, where Paul seems to really be unaware of these traditions because he talks about Jesus as not being of the flesh, right? Jesus not being of the flesh, that the flesh of Jesus' resurrection of the flesh, is a flesh, that flesh awaits the impartation of the Spirit. So that Jesus is not flesh that way, but Jesus is Spirit, and the Spirit waits the impartation of the flesh. This is Paul's thinking, because Paul is not aware of these traditions, right? Of Jesus thinking, and Paul is doing something else. Yeah, let me stop right there. All right. Question from the house.
You had mentioned the two that dressed his body. The other person was Nicodemus.
Yeah, Nicodemus. Thank you. That's right. Nicodemus.
For what we were saying going along the Emmaus Road, it seems like Jesus, his spirit will do that to us now, as long as we do what we're supposed to do. And follow his way, his spirit just come to let us do wrong. You can feel his spirit. You can't see
I like to think of those moments where we, where we think God or Jesus is absent from us or far away from us, that's us being away from Jesus and not Jesus from us. Because that Jesus is always with us too, right? So it's never that Jesus is not there. It's just that we have actually failed to apprehend him, right? To see, to capture, to feel, to know that he's there. Because Jesus said he'd never leave us, right?
Oh God, he's always with us. But when we don't do what we're supposed to do, the spirit of the way that you do it, or if it's like your spirit don't rain down on you, you can excel in him like you supposed to something, you know that he's back away. And I'm just saying because I've been there.
Yeah, I know. There's times when we feel Jesus is the absence of the Spirit, but I think that's us absent and not the Spirit absent.
When he was on the cross, he had Father, why did you forsaken me? And we know that God had that whole situation like this. See, God was on it. But sometimes we can feel like that.
Oh, yeah, we feel like that, yeah. No, I agree with you. We're saying the same thing there. I say that's more about us than it is about God.
Right.
You got the point. That's all I'm saying. All right. Yeah. All right. Any questions? I don't see any. All right. Let us receive the benediction. Lord, we give you thanks for allowing us to come together to study your word, to learn about you, and to welcome your spirit into our presence and to teach us and guide us in the way that we ought to go and to show us who you are. You said when we call on you, you'll come. You said if we ask anything in your son's name, that it would be delivered to us. And you said that you would tabernacle with us, that you would tarry and be with us, and then that you would just be a companion that would teach us. If you were the rabbi then, you are the rabbi now, our true teacher. We give thanks for you and all that we do, and all that have gathered here to study and learn about you. We give you thanks for them. And those who are teaching of you in the way, in their own locations, we give you thanks for them, and we ask that you bless them too as well. Thank you for allowing us to get through Luke. Thank you for the revelations and the fresh knowledge that we have as a result of our diligent searching and seeking after you in the scriptures themselves. Let us find you not only in these words, not only in the testimony, but in our own lives, alive and well, strengthening us and keeping us along the way. Continue to remember your church to help us stand even in these times. And we've been so careful to give your name all the glory that it so richly deserves. Now to the one who was able to present us before the throne without fault or wrinkle, to the one true all-wise God.